History, as we know it, is a tapestry woven with threads of triumph and tragedy, of progress and peril. We remember the great plagues that swept continents, the brutal wars that redrew maps, the famines that brought empires to their knees. Each stands as a monument to human suffering, a stark reminder of our fragility in the face of overwhelming forces. But what if I told you there was a year, a single 12-month span, so catastrophic, so globally devastating, that it has been singled out by modern historians and scientists as arguably the worst period to be alive in all of recorded human history. Worse than the Black Death's arrival, worse than the darkest days of world wars. A year that didn't just bring hardship, but fundamentally altered the course of civilizations, plunging the known world into an era of unprecedented darkness. That year was 536 AD, not a year famed for a singular monstrous battle, nor for the reign of a notorious tyrant, but for something far more insidious, far more elemental. It was a year the sky itself seemed to turn against humanity. Historian Michael McCormick, from Harvard University, famously declared it the grim starting point of an age of misery, a declaration born not from speculation, but from a convergence of ancient records and cutting-edge scientific discovery. For centuries, the true nature of this cataclysm remained a profound mystery, its chilling reality buried in fragmented chronicles, and the very earth that suffered beneath it. What could cause such a prolonged, global dimming of the sun? What power could steal summer from an entire hemisphere, casting a veil so thick that contemporary writers describe the sun giving, quote, light without brightness, like the moon, for over a year? How did this mystery cloud, this dry fog, as some called it, trigger a cascade of disasters, from freezing temperatures and failed harvests to widespread famine and social collapse? And what, if any, was its connection to the apocalyptic pandemic that followed just a few years later, sweeping away millions more? The clues were there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for science to unlock their secrets. In this journey into the past, we will peel back the layers of time to confront the reality of 536 AD. We will delve into the chilling eyewitness accounts, from Byzantine historians to Irish monks, voices echoing across 15 centuries, describing a world plunged into an unnatural twilight. We will uncover the remarkable scientific evidence, hidden in the silent archives of polar ice, ancient trees, and volcanic rock, that has finally revealed the culprit behind this global catastrophe. We will explore the devastating impact of this, quote, volcanic winter on civilizations across the globe, from the fracturing Roman world and the great empires of the East to the smaller kingdoms and tribes struggling for survival. We will investigate how this single year and the difficult decades it ushered in may have irrevocably shaped the course of human history, redrawing maps and perhaps even hastening the end of antiquity. Was 536 AD truly the worst year to be alive? And perhaps more importantly, what can this forgotten cataclysm teach us about our own world, our own vulnerabilities, and the enduring resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity? Prepare to step back into the darkness. Before the sky itself became an enemy, before the sun hid its face and the world grew cold, the year 535 AD was drawing to a close. To understand the true, devastating impact of the darkness that was to come, we must first journey back to this preceding era. We must immerse ourselves in the world as it was, a complex, vibrant, and often turbulent tapestry of empires, kingdoms, and cultures, each with its own ambitions, anxieties, and vulnerabilities. This was no golden age of universal peace, nor a primitive dark age. It was a world in profound transition, a world unknowingly standing on the brink. The grand shadow of the Western Roman Empire had receded in Europe less than a century before, yet its ghost lingered powerfully, shaping the aspirations of new rulers and the lives of millions. In the East, its direct successor, the Byzantine Empire, dreamed of restoring past glories. Further east, another mighty empire, Sasanian Persia, stood as its formidable rival. Across Asia, India was a mosaic of dynamic kingdoms, while China, though politically divided, was a beacon of cultural and technological innovation. And in the Americas, sophisticated civilizations, whose stories were unfolding largely independently, were building cities and shaping landscapes. This was a world teeming with life, interconnected by tendrils of trade, diplomacy, and conflict. A world whose existing pressures and fragilities would amplify the horrors that 536 AD was about to unleash. At the heart of the Mediterranean world, on the cusp of Europe and Asia, lay Constantinople, New Rome. The glittering capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium as historians would later call it. In 535 AD, the throne was occupied by one of the most ambitious and controversial figures in its long history, Emperor Justinian I. He had ascended to power in 527 AD, inheriting an empire that was vast, wealthy, and possessed a formidable administrative and military machine. But Justinian was not content with mere stewardship. He harbored a monumental vision, the Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, the restoration of the Roman Empire. Justinian was a man of immense energy, driven by a profound sense of divine mission and Roman destiny. He was a tireless administrator, a devout Christian who sought to unify the church, and a legal reformer whose efforts would culminate in the Corpus Juris Civilis, a legal code that would shape Western law for centuries. Supporting his ambitions were formidable figures: his brilliant and equally controversial wife, Empress Theodora, whose intelligence and ruthlessness were legendary, and gifted generals like Belisarius, a military prodigy poised to lead Byzantium's armies. Indeed, the early years of Justinian's reign had seen spectacular successes. By 534 AD, Belisarius had swiftly reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, restoring a vital province to imperial rule. The victory sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean, fueling Justinian's confidence and striking fear into the hearts of the Germanic kingdoms that now occupied the former Western Roman territories. Italy, the very heartland of Old Rome, now under Ostrogothic rule, was firmly in his sights. Preparations for its invasion were likely already underway. This ambition, however, came at a tremendous cost. Wars were expensive, requiring vast sums of money, which meant heavy taxation on the populace. Justinian's grand building projects, including the initial phases of what would become the magnificent Hagia Sophia, further strained the imperial treasury. The empire was a behemoth of bureaucracy and logistics, its intricate systems of governance and supply stretching from the Balkans to Egypt, from the Danube frontier to the borders of Persia. While Constantinople itself was a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 souls, a hub of global trade and unparalleled splendor, the empire was not without its internal stresses. The devastating Nika riots in 532 had shaken Justinian's throne, a bloody reminder of popular discontent and political rivalries that simmered beneath the surface of imperial grandeur. The Byzantine state, for all its power, relied on predictable harvests, stable trade routes, and the continued flow of resources. It was a system finely tuned, but perhaps not as robust as it appeared. West of Byzantium, the political landscape was a mosaic of successor kingdoms, forged in the turbulent aftermath of the Western Roman Empire's collapse in 476 AD. Here, Roman traditions and institutions blended, often uneasily, with the cultures and laws of the Germanic peoples who now held sway. This was not a sudden descent into barbarism, as once popularly imagined, but a complex period of transformation, of decline in some areas, and creative adaptation in others. In Italy, the Ostrogothic kingdom, established by Theodoric the Great, had for decades maintained a delicate balance, preserving Roman administration and culture while under Germanic military rule. Ravenna, not Rome, was its capital, adorned with splendid churches and mosaics. But by 535 AD, Theodoric was dead, his successors were weaker, and internal divisions plagued the kingdom. This instability provided the very pretext Justinian needed for his planned invasion. The Italian peninsula, still bearing the scars of earlier upheavals, was about to become a battleground once more, its people caught between two mighty powers. North of the Alps, in former Roman Gaul, the Franks were consolidating their power. Under the Merovingian dynasty, descended from the legendary Clovis, they had carved out a vast and expanding realm. Their conversion to Catholic Christianity had provided a crucial link with the Gallo-Roman population and the Church, facilitating their dominance. Further south, in the Iberian Peninsula, the Visigoths ruled a kingdom striving for stability after a period of internal strife, also navigating the complex relationship between their Arian Christian faith and the Catholicism of their Hispano-Roman subjects. Across the English Channel, Britain was a land of even greater fragmentation. Roman rule had effectively ended over a century before. Anglo-Saxon tribes from northern Germany and Denmark were steadily migrating and settling in the east and south, pushing the native Romano-Britons and Celtic peoples westward into Wales, Cornwall, and north into what would become Scotland. This was an era of conflict and cultural fusion, the very crucible in which the legends of Arthur were likely forged, tales of resistance against encroaching invaders. In Ireland, which had never been part of the Roman Empire, a vibrant Celtic Christian culture flourished, with monasteries becoming centers of learning and art, their monks poised to play a crucial role in preserving knowledge in the centuries to come. While some urban centers in the west declined, and long-distance trade became more localized compared to the Roman heyday, life continued. Agriculture remained the bedrock of society. Germanic kings adopted Roman administrative trappings, minted coins, and issued laws, often blending Roman legal principles with their own traditions. Yet, this was a world far more politically fractured, less centrally controlled, and arguably more vulnerable to widespread environmental shocks than the more integrated East. Each kingdom faced its own internal challenges, its own delicate balances of power and resources. To the east of Byzantium, stretching from Mesopotamia across the Iranian plateau and into Central Asia, lay the other great superpower of the age, the Sasanian Empire of Persia. For centuries, Rome and Persia had been locked in a geopolitical struggle, a near constant cycle of cold wars, proxy conflicts, and outright devastating invasions. This was a rivalry not just of empires, but of civilizations, with deep historical roots and profound cultural differences. In 531 AD, a new Shahanshah, or King of Kings, had ascended the Sasanian throne. Khosrow I, also known as Anushirvan, meaning of the immortal soul. Khosrow would go on to become one of Persia's most celebrated rulers, renowned for his reforms, his patronage of learning, and his military prowess. In 535 AD, he was still consolidating his power, dealing with internal threats like the radical Mazdakite movement, and assessing the shifting dynamics with Byzantium under the ambitious Justinian. An eternal peace had been signed between the two empires in 532, but such treaties were often fragile, temporary truces in an enduring Cold War. The Sasanian Empire was a sophisticated, highly centralized state with a rich artistic and intellectual heritage. Zoroastrianism was the state religion, its priests wielding significant influence. Cities like Ctesiphon, the imperial capital on the Tigris, were magnificent metropolises, centers of administration, culture, and commerce, benefiting from their position along the lucrative Silk Road trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world with India and China. The Sasanians possessed a formidable military, particularly their elite heavy cavalry, the Savarin, who were a match for any Byzantine force. While peace technically prevailed with Byzantium in 535, the underlying tensions remained immense. Both empires watched each other warily across a heavily fortified frontier, aware that any perceived weakness in one could be exploited by the other. The Sasanian heartlands, reliant on complex irrigation systems for their agriculture, were also not immune to the whims of climate. To the east of Byzantium, stretching from Mesopotamia across the Iranian plateau and into Central Asia, lay the other great superpower of the age, the Sasanian Empire of Persia. For centuries, Rome and Persia had been locked in a geopolitical struggle, a near constant cycle of cold wars, proxy conflicts, and outright devastating invasions. This was a rivalry not just of empires, but of civilizations, with deep historical roots and profound cultural differences. In 531 AD, a new Shahanshah, or King of Kings, had ascended the Sasanian throne. Khosrow I, also known as Anushirvan, meaning of the immortal soul. Khosrow would go on to become one of Persia's most celebrated rulers, renowned for his reforms, his patronage of learning, and his military prowess. In 535 AD, he was still consolidating his power, dealing with internal threats like the radical Mazdakite movement, and assessing the shifting dynamics with Byzantium under the ambitious Justinian. An eternal peace had been signed between the two empires in 532, but such treaties were often fragile, temporary truces in an enduring Cold War. The Sasanian Empire was a sophisticated, highly centralized state with a rich artistic and intellectual heritage. Zoroastrianism was the state religion, its priests wielding significant influence. Cities like Ctesiphon, the imperial capital on the Tigris, were magnificent metropolises, centers of administration, culture, and commerce, benefiting from their position along the lucrative Silk Road trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world with India and China. The Sasanians possessed a formidable military, particularly their elite heavy cavalry, the Savarin, who were a match for any Byzantine force. While peace technically prevailed with Byzantium in 535, the underlying tensions remained immense. Both empires watched each other warily across a heavily fortified frontier, aware that any perceived weakness in one could be exploited by the other. The Sasanian heartlands, reliant on complex irrigation systems for their agriculture, were also not immune to the whims of climate. Across the vast oceans, unknown to the empires of Eurasia, complex societies were also flourishing in the Americas. In Mesoamerica, the great city of Teotihuacan, near modern-day Mexico City, was at, or perhaps just past, the zenith of its power and influence. With its colossal pyramids, sprawling apartment compounds, and a population estimated at over 100,000, Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities in the world at this time. Its cultural and economic influence radiated across much of Mesoamerica, though the exact nature of its political control remains debated by scholars. Further south, in the rainforests of Guatemala, Belize, and southern Mexico, the classic period of Maya civilization was in full swing. Dozens of city-states, such as Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, and Copan, vied for power and resources. The Maya were developing sophisticated systems of writing, mathematics, including the concept of zero, and an incredibly accurate astronomical calendar. Their lives were intricately tied to agricultural cycles, primarily the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash, and their religious beliefs were deeply intertwined with the natural world and celestial events. In South America, along the arid northern coast of Peru, the Moche culture was creating remarkable art, particularly their intricate ceramics depicting vivid scenes of daily life, warfare, and ritual. They were master irrigators, transforming desert valleys into fertile agricultural lands. In the highlands, other cultures, like the Tiwanaku near Lake Titicaca and the Wari in the central Andes, were laying the foundations for future empires. These American civilizations, while diverse, shared a common reliance on stable climatic conditions for their agriculture, a foundation that could be catastrophically undermined by prolonged drought or unseasonal cold, even if the direct cause remained mysterious to them. So, what was the general state of the global climate in the years leading up to 536 AD? For the most part, the evidence suggests a period of relative stability, albeit with the usual regional variations and occasional localized extremes that characterize any era. There's some scattered, debated evidence from tree rings and historical accounts suggesting minor cooling pulses or dry spells in certain regions in the preceding decades, but nothing that would presage the scale of the catastrophe to come. There was no clear, global warning sign that the Earth's climate system was on the verge of such a violent perturbation. This relative climatic normalcy, in a sense, makes the events of 536 even more shocking. Societies were generally adapted to the prevailing conditions of the early 6th century. Their agricultural practices, their settlement patterns, their economic systems, all were predicated on a certain predictability of the seasons. There was no collective memory, no societal preparation for what was about to happen when the sun itself began to fail. This was the world of 535 AD, a patchwork of powerful empires and emerging kingdoms, of vibrant cultures and sophisticated societies, each navigating its own complex destiny. A world, for all its strengths and achievements, that was about to be plunged into an unprecedented era of darkness, famine, and disease, triggered by an event that no emperor, king, or priest could have possibly foreseen or prevented. The year 536 AD dawned much like any other. Across the Byzantine Empire, merchants opened their stalls, farmers tended their fields, and imperial administrators went about their duties. In Italy, the Ostrogoths eyed Justinian's ambitions with apprehension. In Persia, Khosrow I continued to consolidate his rule. In China, the northern and southern dynasties navigated their complex political realities. And in Ireland, monks copied manuscripts, largely oblivious to the grand machinations of distant empires. Few, if any, could have predicted that this year would etch itself into the annals of human suffering, not through the actions of armies or emperors, but through a profound and terrifying alteration of the very sky above them. It likely began subtly, perhaps as a persistent mist that didn't burn off with the morning sun, or a peculiar tint to the daylight, a dimming that couldn't be attributed to ordinary clouds. Maybe the sunsets were unusually spectacular for a while, then just dull. We don't know the exact day or week it started, or where it was first definitively observed. But as the early months of 536 progressed, the phenomenon became undeniable, spreading like an insidious contagion across vast swaths of the northern hemisphere. A strange, persistent, and suffocating fog, a mystery cloud, as some later chroniclers would term it, began to descend, veiling the sun and casting a pall over the land. This was no ordinary weather. It wasn't the fleeting gloom of a stormy day or the seasonal mists of autumn. This darkness lingered, day after day, week after week, month after month. The sun, the very source of light and life, seemed to be failing. What must it have felt like to witness such an inexplicable and terrifying event in an age when the movements of the heavens were deeply intertwined with divine will and the fate of humanity? Fear, undoubtedly. Confusion. A dawning, chilling sense that something was profoundly, cosmically wrong. Fortunately, or perhaps grimly, we are not left entirely to speculation. Several contemporary writers living through this very period recorded their observations, leaving us with chilling eyewitness testimonies. Their words, though sometimes sparse, paint a vivid picture of a world losing its light. One of the most crucial accounts comes from the heart of the Byzantine Empire, from a man who was not just an observer, but a key historian of his age, Procopius of Caesarea. Procopius was a learned scholar and legal advisor, accompanying the celebrated general Belisarius on his military campaigns for Emperor Justinian. He was a man of keen intellect, accustomed to observing and recording significant events. Around 536 AD, during the Gothic War in Italy, he documented a terrifying prodigy. In his History of the Wars, Book 4, covering the Vandalic and Gothic conflicts, he writes, "And it came about during this year that a most dread portent took place. For the sun gave forth its light without brightness like the moon during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear, nor such as it is accustomed to shed. And from the time when this thing happened, men were free, neither from war nor pestilence nor any other thing leading to death." Procopius's words are stark and unambiguous. Light without brightness, like the sun in eclipse. For an entire year, he directly links this terrifying atmospheric phenomenon to subsequent calamities, war, pestilence, and every other thing leading to death. His testimony is invaluable, not only for its description, but also for its placement of this event as a precursor to further suffering. He was there, he saw it, and it clearly left an indelible mark on his perception of the unfolding history he was chronicling. Another vital voice from the Mediterranean comes from Italy, a land already bracing for the impact of Justinian's wars. Cassiodorus, a high-ranking Roman statesman and scholar serving the Ostrogothic kings in Ravenna, and later a monk, also left a powerful record of this strange period. In his collection of official letters and documents known as the Variae, compiled around 537 to 538 AD, he includes letters that clearly reflect the dire conditions and the bizarre atmospheric phenomena. In one letter, likely written in 536 or early 537, Cassiodorus laments, "The sun seems to have lost its wonted light and appears of a bluish color. We marvel to see no shadows of our bodies at noon, and to feel the mighty vigor of its heat wasted into feebleness. The moon, too, even when its orb is full, is empty of its usual splendor. Winter has been without storms, spring without mildness, summer without heat. The seasons seem to be all jumbled up together and confused. We have had a winter without frost, a spring without breezes, a summer without sun. What can we hope for when the months that should have been ripening the corn have been chilled by Boreas, the north wind? How can the blade swell if it is not filled by the rains of heaven? How can the ear of corn harden if it is not nourished by the sun's heat?" Cassiodorus paints a picture of utter climatic disarray. A bluish sun, no shadows at noon, a profound lack of heat. He explicitly connects this to agricultural crisis, failed harvests due to the cold and lack of sunshine. His elegant prose conveys the bewilderment and despair of a society facing starvation because the very elements seem to have turned hostile. He even notes, chillingly, that, quote, "fear of a universal famine is rife." His accounts, written from the perspective of a statesman trying to manage a crisis, add a layer of administrative desperation to Procopius's more detached historical observation. Further east, in the Roman province of Syria, another contemporary, John of Ephesus, a Syriac Orthodox bishop and historian, also chronicled these dark times. Though his major historical work is largely lost, fragments and summaries preserved by later chroniclers like Michael the Syrian confirm the widespread nature of the event. Michael the Syrian, writing in the 12th century but drawing on John of Ephesus and other earlier sources, records for the year 536-537. The sun became dark, and its darkness lasted for 18 months. Each day it shone for about 4 hours, and still this light was only a feeble shadow. Everyone declared that the sun would never recover its full light. The fruits did not ripen, and the wine tasted like sour grapes. 18 months, a year and a half of this diminished, shadowy light. John of Ephesus, through Michael the Syrian, emphasizes the duration and severity, 4 hours of feeble shadow light per day. The psychological impact must have been immense, the fear that the sun might never return to its former glory. And again, the direct link to agricultural failure, fruits not ripening, wine tasting sour. These were not isolated observations. They were part of a pattern of experience stretching across thousands of miles. The darkness was not confined to the Mediterranean basin or the Near East. Whispers and cries of this unnatural gloom and its consequences echoed from more distant lands, recorded in the terse but powerful entries of annals and chronicles kept in far-flung corners of the known world. In Ireland, an island on the very western edge of Europe, monastic chroniclers meticulously recorded significant events. Their annals, though often concise, provide crucial corroborating evidence. The Annals of Ulster state simply, for the year 536 AD, Perditio Panis, which translates to a failure of bread. The Annals of Innisfallen are even more explicit, noting a failure of bread from the year 536 AD to 539 AD. These laconic entries speak volumes. Failure of bread meant starvation. For a society entirely dependent on agriculture, on the reliable cycle of seasons, the absence of bread for multiple years was a sentence of widespread suffering and death. The implications of these Irish entries are profound. They demonstrate that the atmospheric event was severe enough to cause catastrophic crop failures even in the far northwest of Europe, a region with a maritime climate that might otherwise be expected to buffer some extremes. The prolonged nature, from 536 to 539 feet, also aligns with the idea of a sustained climatic downturn, not just a single bad year. Thousands of miles to the east, in divided China, imperial scribes were also recording unusual phenomena. The Nanxi, History of the Southern Dynasties, and Beishi, History of the Northern Dynasties, contain entries that resonate with the accounts from the West, though they describe it somewhat differently. For instance, records from the Southern Liang Dynasty mention that in the 5th month, likely June, of 536 AD, yellow dust rained down like snow. Other entries from around this period, and in the subsequent years 537 and 538, speak of summer frosts and snow in July or August, unexpected cold, and widespread famine that led the government to issue edicts of relief for the starving population. One report from the Beishi, referring to the Northern Wei dynasty, notes for 535-536 that stars were not seen for 3 months in one region, and later reports of drought and severe famine. While Chinese records sometimes attribute these events to local or regional factors, or interpret them through their own cosmological frameworks, like the mandate of heaven, the clustering of such unusual climatic events and resulting famines around 536 to 538 AD is highly suggestive when viewed in a global context. The yellow dust could very well be a description of fine volcanic ash or aerosols falling from the stratosphere, a telltale sign of a massive distant eruption. And what of the Americas? Here, the historical record is different. We lack direct written accounts from 536 AD describing the state of the sky in the same way we have from Eurasia. However, archaeological and paleoclimatological evidence, which we will explore in more detail later, points to significant environmental stress in several regions around this time. For instance, there is evidence of severe, prolonged droughts in Mesoamerica affecting both Teotihuacan and various Maya city-states, leading to agricultural crises, societal disruption, and, in some cases, abandonment of settlements, or a hiatus in monumental construction. While it's harder to draw a direct contemporaneous link to a quote-quote dim sun from written records, the timing of these environmental hardships in the Americas is strikingly coincidental with the Eurasian crisis. suggesting they too may have felt the chilling impact of a globally altered climate. So what was this persistent, sun-obscuring veil that the chroniclers described? It clearly wasn't ordinary fog or cloud cover. Procopius calls it a, quote, dread portent. Cassiodorus describes the air as being, quote, unnaturally dry, even as the light failed. John of Ephesus, via Michael the Syrian, mentions the, quote, darkness lasting for 18 months. This suggests something suspended high in the atmosphere, scattering and absorbing sunlight before it could reach the surface. Later science would identify this as a stratospheric aerosol layer, most likely composed of sulfate particles from a massive volcanic eruption. But to the people of the 6th century, it was an inexplicable and terrifying phenomenon, a, quote, dry fog that brought cold and darkness without the moisture of normal weather. Imagine the psychological impact. The sun, a symbol of life, power, and divine order across countless cultures, was failing. For agricultural societies, the sun's rhythm dictated the very cycle of existence. Its dimming wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a fundamental disruption of the cosmic order, a sign of profound celestial displeasure or imbalance. Superstitions would have run rampant. Was it the wrath of God or gods? Was it a sign of the end of the world? Religious leaders would have offered prayers, sacrifices, and interpretations, trying to make sense of the terrifying unknown and appease whatever powers were believed to be responsible. Communities would have been gripped by an existential dread, a fear that the light might never truly return, that this new, gloomy reality was permanent. The descriptions of the sun appearing bluish, Cassiodorus, or like the moon in eclipse, Procopius, are consistent with the optical effects of fine volcanic aerosols in the stratosphere. These particles are very effective at scattering blue light, which can sometimes make the sun itself appear bluish or reddish when viewed through a dense haze, while the overall sky might take on a whitish or murky appearance. The lack of shadows at noon, as Cassiodorus noted, speaks to the diffuse nature of the light. The sun's rays were being scattered in all directions, rather than streaming down directly. This veil was not just a visual anomaly, it was a thermal blanket in reverse, reflecting solar radiation back into space and preventing the Earth from warming as it should. The consequences of this, quote, solar dimming would be immediate and brutal, beginning with a profound and unseasonal chill that would grip the lands beneath the murky sky. The eyewitnesses had documented the darkness. They would soon document its deadly offspring, cold and famine. The descent of the mysterious atmospheric veil, as chronicled by horrified eyewitnesses across the northern hemisphere, was not merely a visual spectacle or psychological torment. Its primary and most immediate physical consequence was a drastic reduction in the amount of solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface. With the sun's life-giving energy choked off by this stratospheric blanket of what we now understand to be volcanic aerosols, temperatures began to plummet. The year 536 AD and the years immediately following did not just bring darkness. They brought a profound, unseasonal, and devastating chill, a phenomenon scientists today refer to as a volcanic winter. The accounts from the period are chillingly consistent on this point. Cassiodorus, writing from Italy, lamented a, quote, summer without heat. He explicitly stated, "We marveled to see no shadows of our bodies at noon, and to feel the mighty vigor of its heat wasted into feebleness." This wasn't just a slightly cooler summer, It was a fundamental failure of the season to arrive. Imagine the experience, expecting the warmth of June or July, the long days of ripening sunshine, and instead being met with a persistent, biting cold, more akin to late autumn or even early winter. Chinese chronicles from this period also speak of summer frosts and unseasonal snowfalls. The Nanxi, History of the Southern Dynasties, records snow in the 8th lunar month, roughly August-September, of 536 in certain regions, a highly unusual event that would have been devastating for ripening crops. These weren't isolated incidents. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, provides powerful, silent testimony to this great chill from across the globe. Tree growth is exquisitely sensitive to temperature and sunlight. In the years following 536 AD, tree rings from Scandinavia to North America, from Ireland to Siberia, show a dramatic reduction in growth, some of the narrowest and faintest rings in millennia. Some even bear the physical scars of frost rings, damage to their cells caused by freezing temperatures during the normal growing season. These silent witnesses confirm that the cold was not just a perception, but a harsh, widespread reality. Estimates based on tree ring data and other climate proxies suggest that average summer temperatures in parts of Europe and Asia may have dropped by as much as 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius, 2.7 to 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit, below the norm. While this might not sound like an enormous figure to a modern city dweller with central heating, for agrarian societies living on the edge of subsistence, and for crops finely tuned to specific temperature ranges, such a drop was catastrophic. It meant growing seasons were drastically shortened, or in some cases, failed to materialize altogether. The immediate and most devastating consequence of this prolonged global dimming and the accompanying volcanic winter was the wholesale collapse of agriculture. Across civilizations, from the sophisticated empires to the smallest tribal communities, human survival was overwhelmingly dependent on the annual harvest. When the sun failed and the cold persisted, the crops failed too. Consider the staples that fed the world of the 6th century. In the Mediterranean and Europe, wheat and barley were paramount. These grains require specific amounts of sunshine and warmth to mature. The quote, light without brightness and the summer without heat, described by Procopius and Cassiodorus, meant that these crops either failed to grow to their full height, produced meager and shriveled grains, or were destroyed by unseasonal frosts before they could even be harvested. Cassiodorus explicitly asked, "How can the blade swell if it is not filled by the rains of heaven? How can the ear of corn harden if it is not nourished by the sun's heat?" His rhetorical questions painted a grim reality. In China, rice cultivation in the south and millet and wheat in the north were equally vulnerable. The reports of summer frosts and snow would have been disastrous for the delicate rice paddies and the ripening grains of the northern plains. In Ireland, the perditio panis, the failure of bread, points directly to the collapse of cereal crops, likely oats and barley, which formed the backbone of the early medieval Irish diet. Even if some hardy root vegetables or forage survived, the loss of the primary carbohydrate source meant inevitable, widespread hunger. The agricultural collapse was not a single event confined to the year 536. The atmospheric veil, as John of Ephesus reported via Michael the Syrian, lingered for up to 18 months. And the climatic disruption, as tree rings and ice cores now tell us, persisted for several years, creating a cascade of failed or drastically reduced harvests. One bad harvest could often be weathered by stored surpluses, if they existed. But 2, 3, or more consecutive years of agricultural failure? That was a recipe for unparalleled disaster. Stored food reserves dwindled and then vanished. Seed grain, vital for future planting, was consumed out of desperation, mortgaging the future for a few more days of survival. The price of whatever food could be found skyrocketed, pushing it beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest. The specter of famine, once a localized or occasional fear, became a continental crisis. The grip of famine tightened across diverse regions, each experiencing the catastrophe through the lens of its own societal structure and environment, yet united by the common tragedy of starvation. In Europe, the impact was devastating. Cassiodorus' letters from Italy are filled with anxious instructions to provincial governors about collecting and distributing what little grain could be found, and with pleas for tax relief for communities ravaged by crop failures. He speaks of the need to import grain, but from where could it be reliably sourced if the crisis was widespread? The Gothic War, which officially began in 535 between the Byzantines and the Ostrogoths in Italy, now played out against a backdrop of increasing starvation. Armies needed to be fed, and foraging by desperate soldiers would have only exacerbated the suffering of the civilian population. The countryside, already disrupted by war, became a landscape of hunger. For the Byzantine Empire, the famines presented a severe challenge. Emperor Justinian's ambitious military campaigns and grand construction projects relied on a steady stream of tax revenue, much of which came from agricultural surplus. Widespread crop failures meant plummeting state income, making it harder to pay soldiers, fund wars, or provide relief. While Constantinople, as the imperial capital, likely had better access to stored grain and seaborne supplies from Egypt, at least initially, the provinces would have suffered immensely. Procopius's linking of the dread portent with war and pestilence suggests a society under immense strain. In China, the historical annals of both the northern and southern dynasties record significant famines during this period. The reports of summer frosts and snow in 536 and 537 directly correlate with agricultural disaster. The Book of Liang, for example, mentions that in 537, many people died of starvation in certain prefectures due to drought and failed harvests. Imperial governments, in line with Confucian ideals of benevolent rule, often attempted to provide relief, opening state granaries and offering tax exemptions. However, the sheer scale of the crisis, likely compounded by the political divisions of the era, would have overwhelmed such efforts in many areas. Mass death from starvation and related diseases became a grim reality. The Irish Annals' terse declaration of a, quote, failure of bread from 536 to 539 underscores the prolonged nature of the crisis in northwestern Europe. In a society structured around small farming communities and local chieftains, with limited long-distance trade in bulk foodstuffs, consecutive harvest failures meant there was little buffer. People would have resorted to eating whatever they could find. Wild plants, seaweed, perhaps even diseased livestock. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavia from this period, such as the mass abandonment of farms in some regions and changes in burial rituals, has been interpreted by some scholars as a response to severe societal stress, very likely linked to this climatic downturn and resulting famines. There are even theories that some of the more desperate Norse sagas and myths of Fimbulwinter, a great 3-year winter preceding Ragnarok, might have roots in the folk memories of this terrible period. And while written accounts from the Americas are lacking for this specific event, the archaeological and paleoclimatological data paints a similar picture of hardship. Severe droughts documented in Mesoamerica around the mid-6th century would have crippled maize production, the cornerstone of civilizations like Teotihuacan and the Maya. This agricultural stress is often cited as a contributing factor to political instability, warfare, and the decline or transformation of major centers in the following decades. The Moche in Peru, reliant on sophisticated irrigation for their coastal agriculture, would also have been highly vulnerable to disruptions in weather patterns affecting water sources. Hunger is a powerful primal force. As famine tightened its grip and spread across the land, it didn't just kill people through starvation, it began to unravel the very fabric of society. Desperation erodes social norms, traditions, and laws. When survival is at stake, the bonds that hold communities together can fray and snap. Historical accounts from various famine periods, though not always specific to 536, give us a grim insight into what likely transpired. Food riots would have broken out in towns and cities as supplies dwindled and prices soared. Those with any remaining stores would have had to defend them from the starving masses. Banditry would have become rampant as desperate people took to looting to feed themselves and their families. Travel would have become perilous. Governmental authority, already strained by falling revenues and the logistical nightmare of relief efforts, would have weakened in many regions, unable to maintain order or protect its citizens. The vulnerable, the elderly, the very young, the sick would have been the first to perish. Families would have faced agonizing choices. There are historical accounts from other great famines of people abandoning children they could no longer feed, or even resorting to cannibalism in the most extreme circumstances, though direct evidence for this in 536 is scarce and often sensationalized. What is certain is that social hierarchies would have been upended. Wealth might offer some protection, but even the rich could not conjure food from barren fields. The normal patterns of life, marriage, childbirth, community festivals, would have been overshadowed by the all-consuming quest for sustenance. Migrations would have occurred as entire communities or family groups abandoned their blighted lands in search of regions rumored to have food, or simply fleeing the despair. These movements of desperate people could, in turn, create new pressures and conflicts in the areas they moved into, further destabilizing an already fragile world. The psychological toll of witnessing such widespread suffering, of living with constant hunger and fear, is almost unimaginable. Crucially, the darkness and the cold that began so dramatically in 536 AD were not fleeting. As Procopius, John of Ephesus, and the Irish annals attest, and as modern science confirms, the initial atmospheric event had long-lasting repercussions. The volcanic winter may have peaked in 536 to 537, but the climatic downturn, what scientists now call the late antique Little Ice Age, persisted For decades, even over a century in some analyses. This meant that even if the sun's visible light gradually returned to something approaching normalcy after 18 months or so, the global climate system had been knocked into a colder, more unstable state. This prolonged period of hardship meant that there was no quick recovery. Populations were not just starved for a year or two, they were chronically malnourished for an extended period. This chronic malnutrition had profound biological consequences. It stunted growth in children, reduced fertility rates, and critically, severely weakened immune systems. The survivors of the initial famines of 536 to 539 were not healthy and robust. They were depleted, fragile, and walking targets for the opportunistic diseases that thrive in times of want and social disruption. The world was weakened, vulnerable, and as the immediate crisis of starvation began to recede, a new and even more terrifying horseman of the apocalypse was already stirring, preparing to ride forth on a pestilential wind. The long shadow of 536 was about to give rise to an even darker terror. The immediate horrors of the Great Dimming and the subsequent volcanic winter, the failed harvests, the biting cold, the gnawing emptiness of starvation had pushed societies across the northern hemisphere to their breaking point. As the acute crisis of 536 to roughly 539 AD began to wane, as the sun's light perhaps grew a little stronger and meager harvests offered a sliver of hope, the world that emerged was profoundly weakened. It wasn't just the landscapes that were scarred, it was the human population itself. Years of chronic malnutrition had taken a terrible toll, leaving behind a populace uniquely vulnerable to the next wave of disaster. Malnutrition is a silent killer, but it is also a formidable accomplice to other diseases. It doesn't just lead to death through starvation, it systematically dismantles the body's defenses. Immune systems, starved of essential proteins, vitamins, and minerals, cannot function effectively. Wounds heal more slowly, resistance to common infections plummets. Respiratory illnesses, dysentery, and other ailments that a healthy body might fight off could now become lethal. The survivors of the famines were, in many ways, ticking time bombs of susceptibility. Children who had endured these years of hunger would carry the marks of stunting and developmental issues throughout their lives, if they survived at all. Fertility rates would have likely dropped, and infant and child mortality, already high by modern standards, would have soared even further. Societies, too, were weakened. The intricate webs of commerce, administration, and social order had been severely damaged. Labor shortages were emerging, not just from those who had died of starvation, but also from those too weak to work effectively. The authority of governments and local leaders, unable to prevent the initial catastrophe or fully alleviate its suffering, may have been eroded. Trust in traditional institutions, perhaps even in the gods or divine providence that seemed to have abandoned them, would have been shaken. This was a world teetering, depleted of its reserves, both physical and psychological. It was into this deeply vulnerable world that a new, microscopic, and terrifyingly efficient killer was about to make its devastating entrance. Just as the initial shock of the climatic catastrophe was beginning to subside, a new horror emerged from the south. In the year 541 AD, a mere 2 years after the Irish annals declared an end to their, quote, failure of bread, a terrifying new pestilence appeared in the Egyptian port of Pelusium, at the eastern edge of the Nile Delta. This was no familiar ailment. This was something new, something swift, and something horrifyingly lethal. It was the first historically documented pandemic of bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Today we call it the Justinianic plague, named after the Byzantine emperor who reigned during its terrifying onslaught, and who himself would contract but survive the disease. Once again, we turn to the keen observations of Procopius of Caesarea, who provided a horrifyingly detailed account of the plague as it struck Constantinople in the spring of 542 AD. His description, written with the precision of a clinical observer and the horror of a witness to unspeakable suffering, remains one of the most powerful accounts of pestilence ever recorded. He describes its insidious arrival, its varied and terrifying symptoms. It began with the Egyptians who live in Pelusium. Then it divided and moved in one direction towards Alexandria and the rest of Egypt, and in the other direction it came to Palestine, the neighbor of Egypt, and from there it spread over the whole world. It did not afflict any particular part of mankind, but it embraced the entire human race. In the majority of cases, it began with a sudden fever. Not many days later, a bubonic swelling, or bubo, developed, and this was not only in the groin, which is called the bubo in medical terms, but also inside the armpit, and in some cases also by the ears, and at different points on the thighs. Procopius goes on to describe the terrible progression of the disease. Some victims fell into a deep coma, others into a violent delirium, tormented by apparitions, and convinced that men were coming to smite them. Many suffered from vomiting of blood. Some died almost immediately. Others lingered in agony for days. He noted the black pustules that covered the bodies of some victims, a symptom of the septicemic form of the plague. He wrote of the overwhelming stench of death, of a city paralyzed by fear and grief. Mortality rate was catastrophic. Procopius claims that at its peak in Constantinople, the plague killed 5,000 and then 10,000 people per day. While these numbers may be an exaggeration born of trauma, modern historians estimate that the plague may have wiped out between 25% to 50% of the population in the regions it struck most severely. Constantinople, a city of perhaps 500,000 people, may have lost up to 40% of its inhabitants. Entire families were extinguished. Workshops fell silent, fields lay untended, and the dead lay unburied in the streets until mass graves were dug. The psychological impact was profound. Procopius wrote, "Then, indeed, it became clear to all that this was no calamity of purely human origin, nor any other that is explicable in terms of known causes, but that it was clearly a scourge from God. From its starting point in Pelusium, the plague spread with terrifying speed, facilitated by the very trade routes that were the lifeblood of the ancient world. Grain ships, merchant vessels, and army movements carried not just goods and people, but also the unseen passengers. Infected rats and their fleas, the primary vectors of Yersinia pestis. It reached Constantinople in 542, then swept through Asia Minor, Greece, and Italy. It spread westward along the North African coast and into Visigothic Spain and Frankish Gaul. It even reached as far as Ireland and Britain by the mid-540s. The Sasanian Empire in Persia was also severely affected. For nearly a decade, from 541 to roughly 549 AD, and then with recurring outbreaks for another 2 centuries, the Justinianic plague ravaged the populations of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, leaving a scar of depopulation that would take generations to heal. The timing is striking. A catastrophic climatic event that causes widespread famine and weakens populations, followed within a few short years by the outbreak of a devastating pandemic. Could there be a connection? While Yersinia pestis itself was not created by the volcanic winter, the conditions fostered by the 536 event and its aftermath almost certainly played a crucial role in the plague's emergence, spread, and lethality. Several theories link the two events. Firstly, the ecological disruption caused by the volcanic winter could have impacted rodent populations. The natural reservoirs of plague are wild rodents. Climatic shifts, unusual cold, drought, or changes in vegetation affecting food sources can cause these rodent populations to either die off, forcing their infected fleas to seek new hosts, like black rats, which live in close proximity to humans, or to migrate, bringing the disease into new areas. It's hypothesized that climatic stress in Central Asia or East Africa, the suspected homelands of Yersinia pestis, could have triggered such a chain reaction, pushing infected rodents and their fleas towards human settlements and trade routes. Secondly, human behavior during the famines could have exacerbated the risk. As people grew more desperate for food, they might have scavenged more widely, potentially disturbing rodent burrows, or coming into closer contact with wild animals. Grain storage, already critical, would have become even more so, potentially attracting more rats to human habitations. Furthermore, the mass migrations of starving people as they sought regions with food could have inadvertently helped to spread the bacterium or its vectors over wider distances even before the plague became epidemic. Thirdly, and perhaps most significantly, the dramatically weakened immune systems of the human population were a critical factor. Malnourished individuals are far more susceptible to infection and far more likely to succumb to disease. A population already ravaged by years of hunger and cold provided fertile ground for Yersinia pestis to take hold and spread like wildfire. The high mortality rates reported by Procopius and others, while horrifying, are more understandable when considering the compromised health of a populace. The famines of 536 to 539 had, in effect, primed the pump for the pandemic that followed. So while the volcanic eruptions of 536 did not directly cause the Justinianic plague, they created a perfect storm of conditions that allowed this ancient pathogen to emerge from its enzootic reservoirs, spread rapidly along human pathways, and inflict maximum devastation upon a metabolically stressed and immunologically vulnerable global population. The two events are inextricably linked in a tragic domino effect. The Justinianic plague, arriving on the heels of the volcanic winter and famine, delivered another crushing blow to the already reeling societies of the 6th century. The consequences were profound and far-reaching, accelerating processes of political and social disintegration. For Emperor Justinian, the plague was a catastrophe that shattered many of his grand ambitions. His attempts to reconquer the Western Roman Empire, particularly the long and arduous Gothic War in Italy, 535 to 554 AD, were severely hampered by the loss of manpower and resources. Armies were decimated by disease on both sides, Tax revenues, already hit by the famines, plummeted further as taxpayers died and economic activity ground to a halt. Across the empire and beyond, the plague created acute labor shortages. There were not enough farmers to till the fields, not enough artisans to produce goods, not enough merchants to conduct trade. Wages for surviving laborers reportedly rose sharply in some areas, but this was cold comfort in a shattered economy. Agricultural land was abandoned, leading to reforestation in some regions and a general decline in cultivated areas. Cities, often the hardest hit by epidemics due to population density, experienced significant depopulation, accelerating a trend of ruralization that was already underway in parts of the West. This demographic vacuum and the weakening of imperial control on the frontiers created opportunities for other groups. In the Balkans, Slavic tribes began to migrate and settle in greater numbers into territories that the Byzantine Empire could no longer effectively defend. Further north, the Avars, a nomadic group from Central Asia, were beginning their westward expansion that would see them become a major power in Pannonia, modern Hungary, and a persistent threat to Byzantium for decades to come. The Sasanian Empire, also hit hard by the plague, faced similar internal strains, which may have impacted its long-term resilience against future threats. The plague also had deep psychological and religious repercussions. Faced with such inexplicable and overwhelming death, many turned to religion for solace, explanation, or deliverance. Christian piety intensified in many areas, with increased veneration of saints and relics. However, it could also lead to despair, fatalism, or scapegoating, as terrified populations sought someone or something to blame for their suffering. This sense that the world was in the grip of divine judgment, first kindled by the dark sun of 536, was undoubtedly amplified by the horrors of the plague. It's crucial to understand that the climatic downturn initiated by the 536 event was not a short-lived blip. Modern paleoclimatology, drawing on evidence from ice cores, tree rings, lake sediments, and glacial movements, has revealed that 536 AD marked the beginning of a distinct period of sustained global cooling known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, or Lolialia. This cold period wasn't uniform, and it had pulses of more intense cold, like the initial shock of 536 to 540s, and another around the 570s. But overall, average temperatures, particularly in the northern hemisphere, remained significantly cooler than the preceding Roman warm period for at least a century, and possibly longer, perhaps not fully recovering until around 660 or even 700 AD. This means that even after the initial atmospheric veil cleared and the Justinianic plague had run its first devastating course, societies continued to grapple with a less favorable climate. Growing seasons remained shorter, harvests less reliable, and the risk of famine higher than it had been for centuries. This prolonged environmental stress had profound, long-term consequences, shaping settlement patterns, agricultural practices, and human health for generations. It wasn't just one bad year or one bad decade. It was a fundamental shift in the climatic baseline, a long, drawn-out struggle against a harsher, less predictable world. The dominoes set in motion by the shrouded sun of 536 continued to fall for a very long time. For centuries, the chilling accounts of the year 536 AD and its dreadful aftermath lay dormant within the pages of ancient chronicles, known primarily to a small circle of historians and classicists. Procopius wrote of a most dread portent, Cassiodorus of a bluish sun, and seasons jumbled up. John of Ephesus, through Michael the Syrian, described 18 months of darkness. These were tantalizing, terrifying clues, but their true cause remained shrouded in the very mystery they described. In a pre-scientific age, explanations naturally veered towards the supernatural. Divine wrath, cosmic omens, the anger of slighted gods. These interpretations, while offering solace or a framework of understanding to those who lived through it, did little to explain the physical mechanism behind such a profound global event. Even as the Enlightenment and the rise of modern science began to offer new ways of understanding the natural world, the 536 event remained largely an enigma. Historians in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries certainly noted these peculiar accounts. Some, like Edward Gibbon in his monumental Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, acknowledged the unusual atmospheric phenomena described by Procopius, but without a clear scientific framework to explain a global dimming of such magnitude and duration, they were often treated as curiosities, perhaps exaggerated local weather, or simply unexplainable prodigies. The idea of a single, identifiable cause for such widespread darkness and cold across continents was difficult to grasp with the scientific tools then available. There were early inklings. Benjamin Franklin, for instance, correctly hypothesized in 1784 that a persistent dry fog over Europe and North America, dimming the sun and causing a severe winter, was linked to the Loki volcanic eruption in Iceland. But connecting this understanding back to the more ancient and fragmented accounts of 536 AD was a leap yet to be made. The first major breakthrough in solving the mystery of 536 AD wouldn't come from dusty archives or ancient texts, but from some of the most remote, inhospitable, and seemingly unchanging places on Earth: the vast ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica. These frozen expanses are more than just ice. They are meticulously preserved chronicles of Earth's past climate and atmosphere. Layer upon layer of ancient snowfall compressed over millennia. Each year, snowfall traps atmospheric dust, volcanic ash, pollen, and chemical traces from the air. As new snow buries the old, these layers are compressed into ice, creating a continuous, datable record stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. By drilling deep into these ice sheets and extracting cylindrical cores, scientists can analyze the chemistry of these ancient ice layers, effectively reading the atmospheric history book of our planet. In the 1980s and 1990s, as ice core drilling techniques became more sophisticated and analysis more precise, a crucial discovery was made. Scientists began to find distinct layers in ice cores from both Greenland and Antarctica that contained unusually high concentrations of sulfate aerosols, microscopic particles of sulfuric acid. These sulfate spikes are the chemical fingerprints of large volcanic eruptions. When a volcano erupts explosively, it spews massive quantities of sulfur dioxide, gas, high into the stratosphere. There, the sulfur dioxide reacts with water vapor to form sulfate aerosols. These tiny particles can linger in the stratosphere for months, even years, reflecting sunlight back into space and causing global cooling. And crucially, the ice cores showed a significant sulfate spike, one of the largest in the past 2 millennia, dating to, you guessed it, right around 536 AD. Another prominent spike appeared around 540 AD. This was a game changer. For the first time, there was concrete physical evidence, independent of historical texts, pointing to a major volcanic event or possibly multiple events, coinciding precisely with the period of the mysterious, quote, dry fog and global cooling. The ice had preserved the smoking gun. Researchers like Michael Sigel, Joe McConnell, and their teams, using ultra-high resolution analysis techniques, have since refined these dates with astonishing precision, confirming massive sulfate deposits in ice layers corresponding to 536 AD and another slightly later, around 539-540 AD. The ice cores were shouting what the ancient chroniclers had only been able to whisper. Volcanoes were involved. While the ice cores provided atmospheric evidence, another silent witness offered corroboration from the ground up. Ancient trees. The science of dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, relies on the fact that trees typically produce one growth ring per year, and the width and characteristics of these rings reflect the environmental conditions during that year. In good growing years, with ample sunshine, warmth, and moisture, trees produce wide growth rings. In bad years, cold, drought, or lack of sunlight, the rings are narrow. A severe, unseasonal frost can even damage the tree's growing cells, leaving a distinctive scar known as a frost ring. When scientists like Mike Bailey at Queen's University Belfast began examining long tree ring chronologies from Irish bog oaks, European pines, and North American bristlecone pines, they found something remarkable. The year 536 AD and several years following it stood out dramatically. Trees across the northern hemisphere exhibited some of their narrowest growth rings in thousands of years. It was as if a switch had been flipped, drastically curtailing tree growth. Mike Bailey, a pioneer in this field, was one of the first to loudly connect these, quote, narrowest ring events with the historical accounts of 536. He noted a particularly severe period of reduced growth starting in 536 and extending into the early 540s, coinciding perfectly with the historical accounts of dimmed sun and famine, and the initial ice core sulfate spike. The trees were essentially recording the volcanic winter. The lack of sunlight and the profound cold had stunted their growth, leaving an indelible mark in their woody archives. Some tree rings from this period even show clear evidence of frost damage during what should have been the summer growing season, further confirming the unseasonal cold reported by Cassiodorus and others. The combined evidence from ice cores and tree rings was compelling. Both pointed to a massive atmospheric disturbance and subsequent climatic downturn, starting in 536 AD, consistent with one or more very large volcanic eruptions. The historical accounts were no longer isolated curiosities, they were human observations of a scientifically verifiable global event. With the evidence mounting, the volcanic hypothesis became the leading explanation for the 536 AD catastrophe. Here's how it works. A sufficiently large and explosive volcanic eruption, typically one ranking high on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, VEI, can blast enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide gas, tens of kilometers up into the stratosphere, far above cloud level. In the dry, stable conditions of the stratosphere, this sulfur dioxide gas converts into tiny droplets of sulfuric acid or sulfate aerosols. These aerosols are so fine that they can remain suspended in the stratosphere for months or even years, gradually spreading around the globe, particularly within the hemisphere of the eruption, or globally if the eruption is in the tropics. Unlike volcanic ash, which is heavier and falls out of the atmosphere relatively quickly, though it can cause its own regional problems like the yellow dust in China, these sulfate aerosols are highly reflective. They act like a planetary sunshade, scattering incoming sunlight back into space and reducing the amount of solar energy that reaches the Earth's surface. This leads to a cooling effect, known as a volcanic winter. The extent and duration of the cooling depend on the amount of sulfur injected into the stratosphere and the altitude it reaches. The effects are typically most pronounced in the summer following the eruption, leading to failed or shortened growing seasons, just as the historical accounts from 536 describe. The next logical question for scientists was, if it was a volcano or volcanoes, which ones erupted? Pinpointing the exact source so long after the event is a monumental challenge, a geological detective story spanning continents and centuries. Identifying the culprit volcanoes involves looking for several lines of evidence. Geological evidence of a massive eruption around the correct time frame. Calderas, widespread ash deposits or tephra layers, and geochemical fingerprinting of volcanic glass shards found in ice cores or distant sediment layers to try and match them to a source volcano. Several candidates have been proposed over the years, and the picture is still being refined, with ongoing research suggesting a complex scenario. One of the strongest candidates for an eruption contributing to the 536 AD event, or perhaps a slightly earlier event in 535 AD that kickstarted the cooling, is the Tierra Blanca Joven, TBJ, eruption of Ilopango volcano in present-day El Salvador. Geological studies have revealed that Ilopango experienced a colossal caldera-forming eruption, one of the largest Holocene eruptions in Central America that blanketed a vast area with ash. Radiocarbon dating of organic material buried by the TBJ ash initially placed it broadly in the mid-first millennium AD. More recent, high-precision dating work, including analysis by Robert Dull and his team, has refined the date of the TBJ eruption to very close to 536 AD. The sheer scale of this eruption, estimated to be a VEI 6+ or even 7, would have certainly been capable of injecting enough sulfur into the stratosphere to cause significant global cooling. Archaeological evidence also shows widespread disruption and abandonment of Mayan settlements in the vicinity of Ilopango following the TBJ eruption, consistent with a major cataclysm. However, the story might be more complex than a single eruption. Some chemical signatures in the Greenland ice cores, particularly certain tephra shards, microscopic fragments of volcanic glass, initially pointed towards a possible Icelandic or even North American source for an eruption in 536 AD. Tracing these tiny shards back to a specific volcano is incredibly difficult, as their chemistry can be similar from different volcanic regions. The double event or volcanic cluster theory has gained considerable traction, championed by researchers like Michael Sigel and Matthew Toohey. This theory posits that the prolonged cooling of the late antique Little Ice Age was not caused by a single eruption, but by a cluster of major eruptions in close succession. The ice cores clearly show two very large sulfate peaks, one around 536 AD and another significant one around 539-540 AD, with potentially another smaller one around 547 AD. The first event in 536 could have been from a high-latitude northern hemisphere volcano, perhaps in Iceland or North America, which would explain the rapid and severe impact on Europe and Asia. The second major event around 539-540 AD, possibly a large tropical eruption, perhaps Ilopango fits here, or another unknown tropical source, would have then reinforced and prolonged the cooling globally, preventing any quick recovery and pushing the climate system into the Lalia. If a major tropical eruption, like Ilopango, was indeed a key player, how did it cause such profound darkness and cooling so far north in Europe and Asia? The answer lies in global atmospheric circulation patterns. Aerosols injected into the stratosphere from a powerful tropical eruption between roughly 20 degrees north and 20 degrees south latitude tend to be distributed more globally than those from high-latitude eruptions. The Brewer-Dobson circulation, a slow movement of air in the stratosphere, carries these aerosols poleward into both the northern and southern hemispheres, where they can then spread out, forming a relatively uniform veil. This explains why the dry fog was reported so widely across the northern hemisphere if a tropical source was involved, either as the primary 536 event or the reinforcing 539-540th event. High-latitude eruptions, on the other hand, tend to confine their aerosols more to the hemisphere in which they erupt, though they can still have a very strong impact there. Today, there is a strong scientific consensus that one or more massive volcanic eruptions were the primary trigger for the 536 AD climatic catastrophe and the subsequent late antique Little Ice Age. The evidence from ice cores and tree rings is overwhelming and mutually reinforcing. The historical accounts, once viewed as puzzling anecdotes, now align perfectly with this scientific narrative, providing invaluable human perspectives on the impact of these natural events. The exact number, location, and precise timing of all the contributing eruptions are still areas of active research and debate among volcanologists, climatologists, and historians. Was it Ilopango in 535-536, followed by an Icelandic or North American event in 536, and then another major tropical eruption in 539-540? Or a different sequence? Scientists continue to search for new tephra layers in peat bogs, lake sediments, and ice cores, performing ever more precise geochemical analyses to fingerprint the volcanic sources. Climate models are used to simulate the impact of eruptions of different magnitudes and locations to see how well they match the proxy data from tree rings and ice cores and the observations from historical records. This scientific detective story is far from over, but the main culprit, volcanic activity on a colossal scale, has been unmasked. In 2018, an article in the prestigious journal Science sent ripples through both academic circles and popular media. Medieval historian Michael McCormick from Harvard University, leading a multidisciplinary team that combined historical analysis with cutting-edge climate science from the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine, made a bold declaration based on new, ultra-high resolution ice core data, and a synthesis of historical and archaeological evidence. McCormick stated that the year 536 AD marked the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year. McCormick's assertion wasn't just hyperbole. It was grounded in the recognition that 536 AD wasn't merely an isolated bad year. It was the trigger, the opening act of a prolonged period of profound global crisis. His argument emphasized the devastating trifecta: the initial shock of the volcanic winter, leading to widespread famine, followed swiftly by the catastrophic Justinianic plague, all unfolding within a longer-term climatic downturn, the late antique Little Ice Age that suppressed recovery for generations. It was this combination, this relentless series of body blows to humanity, that led him to single out 536 AD as the grim overture to an age of unparalleled misery. The darkness it cast wasn't just literal. It was a shadow that fell across decades, even centuries. But how do we define the worst year to be alive? It's a compelling question, but one fraught with complexity and inherent subjectivity. What metric should we use to bestow such a grim title? Is it purely about the number of deaths, the geographical extent of suffering, the duration of the crisis? Or perhaps the psychological impact, the sense of hopelessness and cosmic dread that permeated an era? If sheer mortality is the primary criterion, then certain periods might seem to challenge 536. The peak years of the Black Death in the mid-14th century, for example, or the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-1919, inflicted staggering death tolls in relatively short periods. If we consider human-inflicted horror, the years of the Holocaust during World War II represent an abyss of suffering. However, McCormick's argument, and the case for 536, rests not just on one single metric, but on the compounded, multifaceted, and prolonged nature of the crisis it initiated. Consider the layers of misery. First, the inexplicable terror of the failing sun, a psychological blow to societies deeply connected to natural cycles. Then, the biting cold and the failure of agriculture, leading to protracted, widespread famine, a slow, agonizing death for many, and debilitating weakness for survivors. And then, upon this weakened foundation, the arrival of a terrifying new disease, the bubonic plague, which swept away a vast percentage of an already depleted population. This wasn't just one disaster. It was a cascade, a relentless onslaught that offered little respite for those living through it. The fact that this all occurred in an era with limited scientific understanding of the causes, and therefore limited capacity for effective mitigation beyond prayer and desperate flight, only amplified the suffering. To truly appreciate the claim for 536, it's worth briefly considering some other contenders for the unenviable title of Worst Year and how they compare. Undoubtedly, the arrival of the Black Death in Europe in 1347 and its subsequent ravages were catastrophic. It killed an estimated 30% to 60% of Europe's population in just a few years. A brutal, swift depopulation. The psychological trauma was immense. However, while the Black Death's peak mortality was perhaps higher in affected regions than the Justinianic plague, The 536 event had a more globally widespread initial impact due to the atmospheric veil directly affecting agriculture across the northern hemisphere simultaneously. Moreover, the 536 event set the stage for its own plague. The societal weakening and potential ecological triggers stemming from the volcanic winter were crucial precursors to the Justinianic plague's devastation. So 536 carries the burden of being the trigger for a longer multi-stage crisis. The years 1918-1919 were undeniably horrific. The Great War had just concluded, leaving behind millions dead and a continent shattered. Then, the Spanish flu pandemic swept the globe, infecting an estimated 1/3 of the world's population and killing tens of millions, possibly more than the war itself. The suffering was immense. However, by the early 20th century, while germ theory was still relatively new in public consciousness, and effective treatments for influenza were non-existent, societies possessed more advanced infrastructure, communication, and a nascent understanding of public health measures, however imperfectly applied. The cause of the suffering, while devastating, was more readily identifiable as war and disease, rather than a seemingly supernatural failure of the sun, which added a unique layer of existential dread to 536. The peak years of World War II, particularly 1942 to 1945, witnessed human-inflicted barbarity and death on an industrial scale, including the systematic genocide of the Holocaust. The sheer calculated cruelty and the global scope of the conflict mark these years as an absolute nadir of human behavior. This is a different kind of worst. The horror was primarily man-made, driven by ideology and warfare, while 536 and its aftermath also involved human conflict. Exacerbated by resource scarcity, its initial trigger was a natural disaster of planetary scale, which then cascaded through human systems. The nature of the suffering, while comparable in intensity, had different origins. A closer parallel to 536 is perhaps the year 1816, famously known as the Year Without a Summer. This was caused by the colossal eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in 1815, the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. Like 536, Tambora's eruption injected massive amounts of sulfur into the stratosphere, leading to global cooling, crop failures, famine, and disease outbreaks in many parts of the world. The suffering was severe. However, several factors distinguish it from the 536 period. Firstly, while Tambora was a larger single eruption, the evidence for 536 suggests a potential double punch or even triple punch of major volcanic events in close succession: 536, 539, 540th, 547, leading to a more prolonged and potentially more severe initial dimming and a longer overall climatic downturn, the Lalia. Secondly, 6th century societies were arguably less resilient. They lacked the globalized trade networks, however imperfect, of the 19th century that could, to some extent, move food to famine-stricken areas. They had less advanced agricultural science and fewer alternative food sources. The societal structures were, in many ways, more fragile and more directly dependent on immediate local harvests. What makes the case for 536 so compelling is this unique confluence of factors: the global scale of the initial atmospheric dimming, The profound and prolonged nature of the subsequent cold, the late antique Little Ice Age it triggered, the resulting widespread and multi-year famines, and then the devastating arrival of the first great bubonic plague pandemic, all striking populations with limited scientific understanding or coping mechanisms. It was the relentlessness, the feeling that as soon as one crisis began to ebb, another, even more terrifying one, took its place. Imagine surviving the bewildering darkness and the gnawing hunger of 536 to 539, only to then face the horrors of the plague in the 540s. Imagine your children, already stunted by malnutrition, succumbing to an agonizing disease, for which there was no cure and no explanation. Beyond divine anger, this was not just a bad year, it was the gateway to a dark age, in a very real climatic sense, compounded by pestilence on an unprecedented scale. Furthermore, the psychological terror of the 536 event itself, the sun literally failing, cannot be overstated in a pre-scientific world. While later crises like the Black Death or Tambora were also terrifying, the fundamental order of the cosmos, the reliability of the sun, was not in question. In 536, it was. This added a layer of existential dread that is hard to quantify, but must have been profoundly demoralizing. So was 536 AD unequivocally the worst year to be alive? As with any such superlative, definitive proof is elusive, and arguments can be made for other dark periods in human history, depending on the criteria emphasized. Each major catastrophe carries its own unique weight of suffering. However, if we consider worst, not just as a single peak of horror, but as the initiator of a prolonged, multifaceted, and globally impactful era of decline and suffering, then 536 AD has an exceptionally strong claim to that grim title. It stands as a stark example of how a natural cataclysm can trigger a cascade of human disasters, fundamentally altering the trajectory of civilizations. The combination of global atmospheric shock, sustained climatic downturn, widespread famine, and a devastating pandemic created a crucible of misery that few other periods can match in its complexity and long-lasting impact. Whether it was the absolute worst or simply one of the worst is perhaps less important than recognizing the sheer scale of the human tragedy that began in that fateful, darkened year. It was a year that profoundly tested the limits of human endurance. The cataclysmic events of the mid-6th century, the volcanic winter of 536, the ensuing famines, the Justinianic plague, and the sustained chill of the late antique Little Ice Age did not merely cause immense human suffering. They acted as a powerful catalyst, accelerating profound transformations across the globe and leaving a lasting legacy that arguably reshaped the world. For historians, this period is increasingly seen as a crucial, if brutal, turning point, a hinge between two distinct eras, classical antiquity and the Middle Ages. The traditional date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire is 476 AD. However, many aspects of Roman civilization, law, and culture persisted particularly in the east, Byzantium, and in transformed ways within the successor kingdoms of the west. The world of the early 6th century, as we saw, still bore many hallmarks of antiquity, but the crises that began in 536 AD appear to have dealt a series of devastating blows to these lingering structures and the societies that inhabited them, hastening their decline and paving the way for the different socio-political landscapes of the medieval period. Consider the cumulative impact. Sustained environmental stress from the Lollia made agriculture less productive and life more precarious for generations. Massive depopulation from famine and plague, perhaps reducing the population of Europe and the Near East by as much as 35 to 50% between 541 and 700 AD, fundamentally altered the human-to-land ratio. This demographic collapse led to labor shortages, the abandonment of vast tracts of cultivated land, and the decay of urban centers. Trade routes were disrupted, not just by war, but by the sheer lack of producers and consumers. The grand integrated economic system of the Roman Mediterranean world, already weakened, fractured further. These were not conditions conducive to the maintenance of large, centralized imperial structures in the Roman mold. Political consequences were immense, redrawing the map of power in many regions. In the Byzantine Empire, Justinian's ambitious project of Renovatio Imperii was critically undermined. While his armies did eventually conquer Italy from the Ostrogoths and parts of Spain from the Visigoths, these victories were Pyrrhic, achieved at enormous cost, and against a backdrop of plague and famine that weakened the empire's ability to hold these new territories. The resources, both human and financial, were simply too depleted. After Justinian's death in 565 AD, Byzantium found itself overstretched, struggling to defend its vast frontiers against new and resurgent enemies. The plague, in particular, had hollowed out its armies and its tax base. In Europe, the depopulation and weakening of imperial control created vacuums that were filled by new groups. The most significant of these were the Slavic peoples. Originating from Eastern Europe, they began a large-scale migration southwards into the Balkan Peninsula during the latter half of the 6th century, settling in lands that the plague-ravaged Byzantine Empire could no longer effectively garrison or administer. This fundamentally changed the ethnic and linguistic map of southeastern Europe. Further west, the Avars, a formidable nomadic confederation, established a powerful cognate in Pannonia, modern Hungary, becoming a major threat to Byzantium and the Frankish kingdoms for over 2 centuries. The Frankish kingdoms in Gaul, while also affected by the crises, managed to consolidate their power, though perhaps in a more decentralized, agrarian-based form than before. In Britain, the Anglo-Saxon settlements continued to expand, further shaping the future of England. The Sasanian Empire of Persia, Byzantium's great rival, was also hit hard by the Justinianic plague and likely by the climatic disruptions. While Khosrow I managed to maintain stability and even expand Persian power in some areas, during his long reign, the empire suffered significant demographic and economic losses. Some historians argue that this weakening, compounded by decades of warfare with Byzantium, left Persia more vulnerable to the astonishingly rapid Arab conquests that would begin in the 630s, just a few generations later. The crises of the 6th century may have thus inadvertently helped to set the stage for the rise of Islam and the Arab caliphates, one of the most transformative events in world history. Even in the Arabian Peninsula, there's speculation that the climatic and economic disruptions of Bilaliya may have played a role in societal changes. For instance, the collapse of the Marib Dam in Yemen around this period, a vital piece of irrigation infrastructure, has sometimes been linked to increased rainfall variability, potentially associated with the broader climatic shifts. Such events could have contributed to migrations and shifting power dynamics within Arabia, part of the complex backdrop to the emergence of Islam in the early 7th century. The profound suffering and uncertainty of the mid-6th century also left deep imprints on culture and religion. Faced with inexplicable cosmic events like the dimming sun and overwhelming disasters like famine and plague, many people naturally turned to religious explanations and sought solace in faith. Christian piety appears to have intensified in many parts of the former Roman world. The cult of saints and the veneration of relics grew in importance as people sought intercessors with a seemingly angry or distant god. Monasteries, often situated in more remote rural areas and sometimes better organized to weather agricultural crises, may have gained in influence and became crucial centers for preserving knowledge, literacy, and classical texts through the turbulent centuries that followed. Indeed, the very act of chronicling these events, as done by Procopius Cassiodorus, Gregory of Tours, who wrote later in the 6th century about the plague's impact in Gaul, and the Irish monks, was often a religious undertaking. There was also a rise in apocalyptic thinking in some quarters. The sheer scale of death and destruction seemed to many like the tribulations foretold in religious scriptures, portents of the end times. This could fuel religious fervor, but also despair or fatalism. While much art and literature from this precise period may have been lost due to the general societal disruption, the themes of suffering, mortality, and divine judgment undoubtedly resonated deeply and would echo in the cultural output of subsequent medieval periods. Yet, amidst this litany of disaster and decline, it is crucial to recognize the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit and the capacity of societies to adapt, even in the face of unimaginable hardship. The story of the 6th century is not just one of collapse, it is also one of survival and transformation. Societies did not simply passively endure these crises, they responded. Agricultural practices may have slowly shifted. For example, there's some evidence for a move towards crops that were hardier or more suited to cooler, shorter growing seasons in some parts of Europe. Settlement patterns changed. People moved away from unproductive lands or vulnerable coastal areas. Perhaps new forms of social organization and land tenure emerged in response to labor shortages and abandoned lands. The very structure of rural life may have been reconfigured. Trade, though disrupted, did not cease entirely. It found new routes and new forms. Local and regional economies became more critical, while the grand imperial structures weakened. Smaller, more localized political entities often proved more adaptable. The survivors, having endured unimaginable loss, carried forward the embers of civilization. Knowledge was preserved, skills were passed on, and communities slowly, painstakingly began to rebuild, albeit in a world that was colder, emptier, and fundamentally different from the one their recent ancestors had known. For a very long time, the sheer scale and global interconnectedness of the 6th century crisis were not fully appreciated. The Dark Ages that followed were often attributed primarily to political factors like barbarian invasions or internal decay. The profound role of climate change and pandemic disease as primary drivers and amplifiers of historical change was less understood. It is only in recent decades, through the convergence of meticulous historical research and sophisticated paleoscientific techniques, that the true story of 536 AD and its long aftermath has come into sharper focus. This rediscovery is not just an academic exercise. The legacy of 536 AD is a stark reminder of the profound interconnectedness of human civilization and the natural world. It demonstrates how vulnerable societies can be to sudden environmental shocks, especially when those shocks are compounded. It highlights the crucial role that climate plays in shaping human history, not as a deterministic force, but as a powerful, influencing factor that interacts with human political, social, and economic systems in complex ways. The long shadow cast by the volcanic winter of 536 reminds us that the past is never truly past. Its echoes continue to inform our understanding of the present and our preparations for the future. Year 536 AD. It began, as we've seen, not with the clash of armies or the decree of an emperor, but with a terrifying celestial event. The sun, veiled and dimmed by the aftermath of one or more colossal volcanic eruptions. This atmospheric shroud plunged vast swaths of the northern hemisphere into a chilling, quote, volcanic winter, stealing summer, devastating agriculture, and unleashing widespread famine that gnawed at the foundations of civilizations from Ireland to China. The eyewitness accounts, once fragmented whispers from a distant past, now resonate with chilling clarity, corroborated by the irrefutable testimony of polar ice and ancient trees. And as if this primordial darkness and starvation were not enough, upon a world already weakened and reeling, came the Justinianic plague, the first great pandemic of bubonic plague, sweeping away millions more, emptying cities and crippling empires. The confluence of these events, the relentless 1-2 punch of climate catastrophe and pandemic disease, marked the mid-6th century as an era of almost unparalleled human suffering, ushering in the prolonged chill of the late antique Little Ice Age and fundamentally altering the course of history. The story of 536 AD, rescued from the dim recesses of history by modern science, is more than just a fascinating chronicle of a forgotten disaster. It holds profound and unsettling echoes for our own time, offering stark lessons that we ignore at our peril. Firstly, volcanic risk. The Earth is a geologically active planet. Super eruptions, like those that likely triggered the 536 event, are low probability but exceptionally high impact events. They have happened repeatedly in Earth's past, and they will happen again. While we cannot prevent them, understanding their potential global consequences for climate, agriculture, and societal stability is crucial for developing mitigation and preparedness strategies. The 6th century had no warning. We, with our advanced monitoring systems, have a better chance. but the scale of the challenge would be immense. Secondly, climate change. The catastrophe of 536 was a natural experiment in rapid climate change, albeit triggered by volcanic aerosols rather than anthropogenic greenhouse gases. It demonstrated unequivocally how profoundly and swiftly climatic shifts can disrupt agricultural systems, trigger famines, displace populations, and destabilize societies. Our current human-caused climate crisis is unfolding over decades rather than months, but its potential to cause similar widespread disruption to food security, water availability, and global stability is undeniable. The Lalius shows that even a seemingly small average temperature drop can have enormous consequences when sustained over time. Thirdly, global interconnectedness and cascading crises. The 6th century, much like our own, was an interconnected world, linked by trade, migration, and shared environmental systems. The events of 536 show how a crisis originating in one sphere, the atmosphere, can cascade through others: agriculture, human health, social order, and political stability. The Justinianic plague exploited these connections, spreading rapidly along trade routes. Today, our hyper-connected world faces similar vulnerabilities, whether from pandemics that can circle the globe in days, or from disruptions to global supply chains that can have far-reaching economic consequences. And finally, the story of 536 underscores both societal fragility and human resilience. It reveals how even powerful empires and established civilizations can be deeply vulnerable to unexpected shocks, particularly when multiple crises converge. Yet it also speaks to the remarkable capacity of human beings to endure, to adapt, to rebuild, and to find new ways forward, even in the face of unimaginable loss and hardship. Understanding past crises like the one initiated in 536 AD is not merely about cataloging historical miseries. It's about gaining critical perspective. It helps us to appreciate the long-term forces that have shaped human civilization, to recognize patterns of vulnerability and resilience, and to make more informed choices about our future. By studying how past societies responded to existential threats, both successfully and unsuccessfully, we can glean valuable insights for navigating the complex challenges of the 21st century. The sun eventually did return to its full glory after the darkness of 536 and the subsequent years. The devastating chill of the late antique Little Ice Age eventually gave way to warmer climes. Societies, though scarred and transformed, recovered and rebuilt. New civilizations rose. New chapters in human history were written. The darkness passed, as it always does. But the memory of that terrible year and the decades of hardship it ushered in serves as a profound and humbling lesson etched into the very fabric of our planet and our collective past. It reminds us that our tenure on this earth is contingent, our civilization's precious, and our relationship with the natural world one of profound interdependence. The story of 536 AD is a call to humility, to preparedness, and to a deeper appreciation for the enduring light that follows even the darkest of times, and the wisdom we must cultivate to navigate the shadows that may yet come.
If this deep dive into the chilling history of 536 AD and its global impact captivated you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button if you found this journey enlightening, and subscribe for more explorations into the fascinating, forgotten, and formative events of our past. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you won't miss our next adventure into history and science. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think, was 536 truly the worst year to be alive, or do you have another contender in mind? Share your perspectives.